now that we have set up our JSON server and have also learned about fetch and how we can make use of fetch to communicate with the server, let's go ahead and update our React application to make use of fetch to communicate with our JSON server to fetch the data. One of the most important things that you need to ensure when you're doing the exercise of communicating with the server is that the server should be up and running. So if your server is not up and running, then in your server folder, at the prompt, type JSON server --watch db.json -d 2000 -p 3001 and let the JSON server be up and running. And you need to leave this JSON server up and running so that our React application can communicate with this server. To make use of fetch, let's add cross-fetch to our React application. So at the prompt, type yarn add cross-fetch at 2.1.0. And once cross-fetch is installed into our application, let's go ahead and begin updating our application. Going to your application, in the shared folder, let's create a new file and name it as baseurl.js. Now, this is a configuration file where I will set up whatever I require for communicating with the server. So here, let me configure a constant called as base URL, which refers to my server's address. So this way, if my server is running at a different location, I would have a single place where I need to update the server address and don't need to go to change the rest of my application. So after configuring this, then we will go ahead and then set up our application. So we'll configure our application to fetch dishes, comments, and promos from the server. The leaders part, I will leave that as an exercise for you in the final assignment. To set that up, let's go into action types.js file. And in the action types.js file, let's set up a few more action types. The next one I will set up is called add comments. And this would be configured as add comments. Then comments failed and comments failed. Promos loading. So this is for the promotions. As you can see, the structure of how we set up our application is similar for anything that we are fetching from the server here. So for the promos, we'll do first promos loading, add promos, and promos fail. Now you may be wondering why I don't have a comments loading. The comments will be loaded behind the scenes. When we render our application, we will first render the home component. By the time the home component is rendered, the comments will also be fetched in. So by the time we navigate to the dish detail component, the comments would have already been fetched in. So that's why I don't have a specific comments loading part set up in my application. Now, once we have done this, then we'll go into action creators.js file and then set up a few more action creators. Now in actioncreators.js file, we realize that we need to communicate with the server. So I'm going to import the base URL from shared base URL so that we can make use of it while configuring our server. Now that we have fetched the or included the base URL, then the first thing that we would do is to use fetch in the fetch dishes part of our application. So in the fetch dishes part, remove this. Now this was originally put in place in order to simulate the communication with the server. Now I'm going to replace that by the actual communication with the server. So this is where we're going to make use of fetch to communicate with the server. So how do we communicate with the server? So we'll say return fetch base URL plus dishes. So recall that the dishes are accessible at localhost :3001/dishes. So when we set up fetch, we need to give the full URL of the location where we are able to fetch the dishes information. And then after that, we realize that we will set up the then to handle the promise that is returned. So in the then, when the promise resolves, we'll first convert the incoming response into JSON. So by calling response.json, so this would convert that into JSON so that it can be processed thereafter. Now, once we have done that, then we need to take that JSON. So once the JSON, so this response.json will convert that to response.json, and that will become available here, and then we'll call that as the parameter as a dishes parameter. So this is the callback function that we have set up here, and then similarly this is the callback function. Now you see me using the arrow function here. So we'll say dishes, and when the dishes is obtained, we will dispatch this to add dishes method that we have set up, and then simply pass the dishes into the add dishes method. That is it. So my fetch dishes is now set up to go and fetch the dishes, and then once the dishes are obtained, then it'll push the dishes into the Redux store here by dispatching that to the dishes there. Now, similarly, we'll set up fetch comments. To set up fetch comments, I'm going to copy this and then simply go down here and then set up the fetch comments here. And so we'll edit this as fetch comments. Now, again, when you are copying, make sure that you do the edits correctly. Otherwise, you will end up chasing after errors that will consume all your time. So when you say fetch comments, here for the comments, we are not going to set up something like the comments loading. So we don't need that. We'll simply directly go and fetch from the comments. And so the comments will be fetched from base URL plus comments. And so this would be response.json. And then when we obtain comments, we'll dispatch it to a function called add comments that we will obviously implement in a short while. And then so we'll say dispatch to add comments. Now, just like we had dishes failed and add dishes, we will have to add the comments failed and add comments. Now, if you're wondering where will we use the failed, the dishes failed and comments failed and so on, we'll do that in the next exercise. We'll see how we make use of that in the next exercise. So this one would be comments failed. And so the corresponding action type would be comments failed, and the payload is error message. And then the next one is add add comments, and this will receive comments as the parameter, and then the action type would be add comments, and the payload will be comments. So you see that the structure is exactly the same as the dishes. So if we set up our code to be very, very structured, then it becomes more easy to make modifications and then add new types. Now, for the promos, I would require exactly what I did with the dishes also. So I'm just going to copy the dishes, the fetch dishes, dishes loading, and so on, and then edit that code to set up the code for the promos, all the action creators for the promos. So here we'll say fetch promos. I'm not using promotions, the complete word here, just to save myself the trouble of typing the whole thing. So here we'll say promos loading, and this would be fetched from promotions, and then here we'll obtain promos and dispatch add promos, and then promos. Again, make sure that you are editing the code carefully to ensure that everything is properly updated. So this would be promos loading. So that's why this should also be promos loading, and then promos failed, and then action type promos failed, and then the last one would be add promos, and promos. And so that way all our action creators for fetching the comments, the promos, and also the dishes are all set up now. Wonderful. Now we need to update our reducers. So since our comments and promotions need to be updated, so I'll go into the dishes, and you would see that in the add dishes we have everything set up accordingly, right? So this is a good structure for us to follow for comments as well as for promotions. So going into comments, now the comments state would be of the type. So in here I am not having comments or is loading for the comments. So for this one, the state would just contain error message null, and then comments initially would be an empty array, as you would expect here. And then this one, the add comments. So here we have the add comment. The add comment is for adding a new comment, but then now we need add comments and comments failed. Now the add comments and comments failed would be very similar to the way we have done for dishes. So let me open dishes, and then I'm just going to copy the add dishes thing from dishes.js, and then I'll come in here and then add that in. So this would be add comments, and so we'll say state is loading false, error message is null, and then the last one would be comments is action payload. So that is for add comments. Now for comments failed, it'll be exactly the same as the dishes failed. So I'm just going to copy that. And then for the comments failed, let me just paste that in here and then edit that. for comments failed, the state would be state is loading false, error message action payload, and then this would be comments is an empty string. So comments failed would be that. Now for the add comment, we'll receive the comment as action payload, and then we'll say comment ID we have set it up as state. So here you notice that this should be updated as state.comments.length. So comments.comments is the place where we store the array of comments. So this should be state.comments.length. Now this one, we will have to remember that the state shape has changed here. So that's why this should say ... state. So whatever was in the state, and then comments will be updated as state.comments.concat. So we will concatenate the comments into state.comments, and then we'll set comments to be that. And so that is the change that you need to make for the add comment, and the default remains as such. So that is how we would set up and update the comments reducer here. Now for the promotions reducer. So in the promotions reducer, again, we'll look at dishes, and then the update to the promotions would be exactly the same structure as the dishes. So I'm just going to copy this part from the add dishes and then go into add promotions, and then just paste it in there and then edit that part. So for here, we'll say add promos. And so here it'll state is loading, error message null, and then the last one would be promotions is action payload. And then for the second part, promos loading, state is loading is true, error message null, and then this would be promotions is an empty string. And then the last one would be promos failed, state is loading is false, and then error message is action payload, and then promotions is an empty string. Now the state shape has to be changed, just like the dishes here. So I'm just going to go into the dishes and then just copy that part, because my promotions state structure would be very similar to the dishes state structure. So for promotions, we'll be saying is loading true, error message null, and then this one would be promotions empty. So that's how we will update the promotions reducer here. Also, in the comments file, we no longer need this comments there, because that is all going to be fetched from the server. And similarly, in the promotions, I will also need to import the action types into the promotions. So let me paste that, and then I don't need this promotions also in my promotions.js file. So now that our reducers are all updated, we will go into the components and then update them. In the components, now I will go into the main component. In the main component, recall that we had the fetch dishes that we have set up already here. Now, just like the fetch dishes, I need to also set up the fetch comments and the fetch promos. So let me just copy this line there, and the two things that I'm going to set up here is for fetch comments, and then this would be dispatch fetch comments, and then the next one would be fetch promos and dispatch fetch promos. Now, so just like we fetch the dishes, we need to fetch the comments and the promos also. And where do we do this fetching? In the component did mount. So we'll go ahead and do fetch comments and then fetch promos here. So this will ensure that when my main component is mounted, then I will go and fetch all these from the server. Now this also means that I need to go and update the home component. So here in the home component, my promotion would be this.props.promotions, and then let me go ahead and send in the remaining two, the is loading and the error message also. So this would be promos loading. So this props promotions is loading, and then promos error message. Say this props promotions error message. So the home component now needs to pass in for the promos also, just like we did for the dishes. And similarly, coming down to the comments here, the comments now are going to be in this props comments.comments, and then we'll also have to pass in the comments error message. So let me copy that error mess here, go to the next line, and then paste that thing in there. And then so we'll say comments error message. So this would be from this props comments error mess. And one minor update here to the line here, it says import add comment fetch dishes. We also need to update to import fetch comments and fetch promos from Redux action creators. We have just created them in the action creators there. So with this, my main component is now updated to fetch the dishes, comments, and promos, and then pass in any loading and error message attributes to both the home component and the dish detail component. Now, we need to update the menu component, the home component, and the dish detail component also appropriately. So let's start with the menu component. So going into the menu component. Now, in here, we were fetching the image by saying source dish.image. Now, what we're going to do is to fetch this image from the server. So let me import base URL from shared base URL, and then we will fetch the image from base URL plus dish. So this card image, the source, when you specify that to be a server and the location of the image on the server, then this will ensure that you will go and fetch the image directly from the server. So we'll be fetching the image from the server before rendering the items here, instead of using the images that are configured in our application, because that is how we want it to be. We want, because if the dishes or in the server is updated, then I don't want to suddenly realize that the corresponding image doesn't exist in my application, and so I wouldn't know how to render the image. So all images required for the dishes, the promotions, and also the leaders will also be fetched from the server side. So the only images that I will use from locally is the logo. That obviously is not going to keep changing all the time. So that would be the only local image that I will use from the assets folder in the public folder. So in the assets folder, assets images folder, I will no longer be needing all these other ones except logo. All the remaining ones I'm going to fetch directly from the server. So in principle, you could go ahead and remove all the images except the logo.png from the assets images folder, and your application would still be able to work correctly. So that's the change that we will make in the menu component. Now going into the home component. In the home component also, we will make the same change. So I will paste the base URL just like I did in the menu component. And then when I am rendering the card here, so we'll say source is base URL plus item.image. And then down below here, when I'm rendering the promotions, notice that I am also going to be receiving the ease loading and the error message for the promotions. So I need to update that exactly like this. So I'm just going to copy that part and then paste it in here, and then just go ahead and update this to props promos loading, and then props promos error message here. So that way my home component will also render an error message if that is encountered. Now similarly, going into the dish detail component, so you see that we need to do the updates for all these accordingly. So let me copy the base URL configuration from the menu component, come into the dish detail component, and then paste it in here so that I will be importing that appropriately. And then in the render dish also, where I have the image, well, say base URL plus dish.image there. Now with all these changes, let's save all the changes and then go and take a look at our application in the browser. Going to my browser, you will now see that in the browser, the dishes and the promotions information, including the image, is going to be fetched from the server. But the leaders part, I haven't fixed that. So that is going to break. So the leader image is not going to be shown here because we updated the render item in the home component, and so that is going to break, but you will be fixing this as part of your fourth assignment. Now, let me again reload my application, and then you can see that the loading messages are shown initially before the information gets loaded from the server. And then similarly, when I go to About Us, everything should look the same. And in the menu, also all the menu items would be rendered just like before. And then I can go to any particular dish and the dish details would be rendered exactly the same as before. And all this information has been fetched from the server. So in the About Us also, you will be fixing up the About Us to fetch the leader's information from the server and then render that in the fourth assignment. Now, to convince you that indeed we are going and fetching information from the server, let's bring up the developer tools and the JavaScript console. In the JavaScript console, you would see that at the start, you will have dishes loading, promos loading, firing up initially. So these two are fired up because we do the fetch dishes, fetch comments, and fetch promos. So these two actions are fired to the system. And then here you would see that this says add dishes and then add comments and add promos. So you see that these three have been fired into the Redux store, and so that will insert the information into the store. So to prove that to you, when you open the previous state and before the add comments action takes place, you see that the comments is empty at this moment. But then when you look at the action is fetching all the comments in the payload. So this has been fetched from the server. And then the next state, you can see that the 20 comments have been added into my add comments here. You can see the same thing under add promos. Now, to further convince you that indeed this information has been fetched from the server, let's go and take a look at what has been printed in our terminal window or the command window where our JSON server is running. Going to the command window or your terminal where your JSON server is running, you notice all these GET requests that have been posted to your server there. And you also notice the places where the 404 has been posted there. So when you look for this particular item in the server with this URL, this doesn't exist on the server. So that's where you run into problems there because we are not fetching the right thing from there. But for the dishes, the comments, and the promotions, everything has been fetched from the server. So when the server was accessed through a GET request, the server sent back the information. Now, why do we see it 2 times here? Because I reloaded my browser. So when I reloaded the browser, it issued one more set of requests to the server. But the second time around, you see a 304 saying not modified. So when you see a 304, that means that the data actually was not sent because it already sent earlier and that has been cached by my browser. So it doesn't have to be sent again the second time I try to access to download the same thing from the server side. So you see that indeed our application has been updated to use fetch to fetch the information from the JSON server. With this, we complete this exercise. In this exercise, we have demonstrated how we can make use of fetch to go and fetch the information from our server and then make use of that information within our application. And indeed, after the information is fetched, after the data is fetched from the server, the data was pushed into the Redux store to update the store's state, and which then is used for rendering the views in our application. This is a good time for you to do a git commit with the message fetch from server.